Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hello there. Welcome to week 2 of Minds, Technology, and Society, Spring 2018. Our speaker series funded with funding from the Glushko and Samuelson Foundations that I'm contractually obligated to mention. All right.
Are you allowed to say that you're contractually obligated? I feel like...
I haven't read the contract. Today our speaker is Cristina Moya, who's coming to us. She just recently joined the faculty at the Department of Anthropology at UC Davis. Cristina got her PhD in biological anthropology from UCLA, then went on to do a series of postdocs at the University of British Columbia, Harvard, and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology.
You forgot the best one.
Oh, and the London School of Tropical and, no, what is it?
Hygiene and Tropical Medicine.
Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Yeah, those two go hand in hand. Sorry, that is the best one. Cristina and I think met at the National Institute for Biological and Mathematical and Biological Synthesis.
We're really bad at this.
Yeah, very terrible acronyms. A number of years ago. Anyway, Cristina's awesome. She does really cool work on identity and ethnic boundaries and human cultural evolution. So with that wonderful and eloquent introduction, I give you Cristina Moya.
That kind of puts the burden off of me in terms of having to be eloquent. And I apologize on behalf of Paul for making you listen to such weirdo people from different disciplines, but I've been having a great time here and learning a lot from you guys. What that means is that I'm really happy to take clarifying questions throughout the talk because we might be using different jargon, and I'm trying not to use jargon, but we forget what's obvious to us and what's not. So yeah, feel free to interrupt me if anything's unclear. So this is a picture that I took in the Peruvian highlands where I do most of my field work that I'll come back to try to convince you that this is a really great context in which to study some questions related to how humans think about ethnic boundaries, linguistic boundaries. But I want to start off first with maybe a discipline that you're more familiar with and perhaps not too cozy with yourselves, but some of the questions that I'm interested in are motivated by some of the same questions that social psychologists have been interested in. So since Teifel and his colleagues introduced the minimal group paradigm and realized that humans are really susceptible to exhibit in-group favoritism, in-group favoring allocations of resources or rewards on the basis of really arbitrary kinds of markers. So very famously, and at least most aesthetically pleasingly, on the basis of people's aesthetic preferences for artists that happen to be Klee or Kandinsky. Presumably all of you guys know this type of work, right? Or no? Okay, so Teifel and his colleagues were motivated by wanting to understand like why intergroup animosity took the form that it did, and whether if you took away all of the kind of contextual baggage, historical baggage that you saw in the real world, you could distill it to the essence of like even an arbitrary marker between strangers, assigned to something that's not very important. Sometimes they did it with random allocation based on dye or shirt colors, could still trigger some ethnocentric-like biases or in-group favoring biases. And they found that it seems to do so. At least under certain sets of conditions that we'll come back to later, this has been like a whole cottage industry now in social psychology, trying to understand the kinds of in-group favoring biases that it promotes and the circumstances in which it happens and when you can break it. So we'll come back to that later to kind of recap what that can tell us about human evolutionary history. Unfortunately, their theorizing, I find, is a bit lacking. So we want to understand, as an evolutionary anthropologist, I want to understand why is that the case. Presumably a lot of psychologists want to understand why that's the case. A lot of cognitive scientists want to understand why that's the case. One kind of why answer is that became social identity theory. Theory. Oh no, I hope I'm not making anyone upset yet. Is that human self-esteem becomes really tied up with the kind of reputation of the groups that they belong to, and so by aggrandizing the groups that they belong to, people feel better about themselves. but I want to ask, no, but really why? And so what I mean by that is, perhaps from an evolutionary perspective or a functionalist perspective, why would we even expect that to be the case? Why do people care about their self-esteem? Why would it be tied up to their group identity? As an evolutionary anthropologist, I also try to stress the more kind of ecologically valid approaches to these questions, although I see the value of stripping down reality into basic minimum and doing things in the lab and using evolutionary functionalist frameworks. So one of the ways that we motivate our work is by kind of observing that humans across the world do universally and uniquely as a species structure themselves into what I'm going to call ethnic groups. And just because this word means different things to different people, I want to just use it today as symbolically marked groups of people who share cultural attributes, perhaps institutions, norms, perhaps skills. Okay, so that people go out of their way to signal to each other their group membership. And the boundaries that we form are signaled in different ways, and they are associated with different kinds of cultural traits, so they're quite variable, but they're universal. And by this minimalist definition, I would include kind of subcultures and religious groups within complex nation states, such as Amish, for example, or Mormons, not religious groups like punk, in addition to kind of tribal groups that anthropologists have more traditionally studied. Another source of insight and motivation for our work is to look at other species. So I already alluded to this a bit. If you went to our closest relatives, non-human relatives, you do see complex social groups. Well, it depends what you mean by complex, but they do live in social groups, and they have some proto-culture, but they don't go out of their way to mark themselves symbolically, and the cultural traits that they have are fairly few. And it's unclear so far whether they use any of that cultural information as kind of a way to predict behavior about others or in any kind of socially meaningful way. Okay, so this suggests that because we're a culture-bearing species, we have produced certain kinds of social group worlds that have formed an important part of our evolutionary history. And for me, the question then arises, what cultural and genetic evolutionary processes could have given rise to ethnic phenomena, and what are the consequences for the way that we see people within and between and outside of groups? So I'm going to black box kind of the cultural evolutionary processes whereby humans produce these, what I'm calling ethnic landscapes. And for today, I'm going to focus on what are the consequences of these ethnic landscapes for human reasoning. How do we adapt to these ethnic landscapes? How do we function in a reasonable way in these ethnic landscapes? And one possibility is that we have ancestral, plastic, cognitive adaptations that we share with other non-human primates for example, detecting statistical correlations that we just apply to these new ethnic landscapes without any new evolutionary pressures. Another possibility is that these ethnic landscapes themselves shaped genetic evolution and changed the genetic adaptations that we all have as humans. And probably this is something that happened with language evolution, for example, but the best documented example of this is some people's ability to digest milk into adulthood. It's something that only happened in populations that developed culturally kind of dairying cultures. And the third possibility is that we develop cultural adaptations as groups. So through cultural evolutionary processes, we developed ways to deal with these ethnic landscapes. And for example, I would argue that a lot of kind of in-group favoring biases that often are thought of at the individual level by psychologists might actually be cultural adaptations for thinking that in-groups are great. I don't know if that's quite clear, but we can discuss that later. I'm happy to discuss any of these claims later, but the intuition is that at the individual level, it's not so beneficial to delude yourself into thinking that your group is great if you could be doing better somewhere else. Okay. So I'm going to talk about how these ethnic landscapes might have given rise to certain ethnic reasoning adaptations, be they genetic or cultural. Oftentimes we can't really differentiate them on the basis of the data that I can get, but I'm happy for feedback. And I'm also going to further argue that instead of thinking about group phenomena monolithically, we should try to think about the features of the ethnic landscapes that map onto features of the reasoning, the psychology, the reasoning adaptations. Okay? So for example, in places where you have social institutions to punish people who don't act pro-socially towards the in-group, then you might expect to see psychological adaptations or propensities for behaving altruistically towards the in-group. But you might not get in-group altruism in the absence of third-party punishment, for example. But independent of that, even whether or not you have punishment institutions, you might still have norm clustering and kind of out-group or group-level homogeneity along certain cultural traits. If, for example, everybody in this society drives on the right side of the road, or you happen to be on semesters here, and I happen to be on quarters in Davis, and so that that can promote certain kinds of stereotypes about individuals on the basis of the group membership that they have, whether or not you're going to be altruistically inclined with the group. And again, it can be quite separate, the question of whether you believe that your group identity is stable through your life and inherited from parent to child. And one possible kind of cultural institution that can promote beliefs about group stability or identity stability, often called essentialism or parts of essentialism in psychology or developmental psychology, would be whether you have norms that really encourage marrying within the in-group. So if what we call them endogamous groups, so if groups really promote only marrying other people from within the group, then you can be fairly sure that your group membership is not going to change within the course of your life when you marry somebody outside the group, for example, and you can be fairly sure that the children of the parents are also going to be members of the same group. But if you don't have endogamous institutions or marrying in-group beliefs, you might not necessarily get these kinds of ideas, essentialist ideas, that group membership is stable. And today I'm going to be focusing on linguistic boundaries specifically, and I'll talk about why, which is just one of the many markers that humans use for delineating group boundaries. Does this at least make some sense to people? Nobody's going to raise their hand, but if it doesn't, somebody has to be brave. Oh, yeah.
Quick question, actually, just to be absolutely clear. The list of elements under linguistic boundaries correspond to just potential elements of, what is it? In the prior slide, it was...
Like ethnic landscapes?
Landscapes, right? They're
Yeah.
not,
It's not exhaustive.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
That sort of thing.
Definitely, definitely. These are some of the ones that I have data for, and I think that there are other phenomena like kind of whether you use the in-group altruism, for example, to engage in hostile behavior with the out-group, it can be quite separate as well. This might be like a precondition, like we don't think of it this way, but warfare is kind of an altruistic act towards in-group members at the expense of out-group members. But, yeah.
Just one quick follow-up question with regards to the EGs or the examples given. The norm clusters doesn't have that. Is that just assumed to be a feature of all ethnic landscapes, is to have some norm clustering?
So I guess I can't think of any other reason why you would get a landscape that would promote stereotyping, whereas I could think of other examples of features that could promote stability even if it wasn't super endogamous. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So the reason I'm going to privilege linguistic boundaries for this talk, and I think that there might be some theoretical reasons why it might be particularly important in human evolutionary history, and one way that cultural evolution might have shaped human cognition, is that language boundaries have been really important ways of organizing social behavior for much of human space and time. And this is a map of Papua New Guinea, which is one of the most ethno-linguistically parts of the world today. But it serves as a reminder that we probably had much more linguistic variation before so many imperial expansions kind of promoted language extinction, and nation states have also clamped down quite a lot on language diversity. So the rate of language extinction is something that linguists really worry about. And there are places that still have quite a lot of diversity that might be more representative of much more of human evolutionary history. Yeah.
Wouldn't it be fair to argue that the subcultures you identified earlier serve that same role, that punk language is different enough from academic language that we have similar sorts of barriers?
It could well be, yeah, for sure. Like within complex nation states or complex cities, for example, there are a lot more roles and niches that people fill and try to differentiate themselves from each other. A complexity that I haven't really thought nearly enough about is that there's also generational shifts in the way that people use language. So teenage language is different from my language, unfortunately. Not enough that we can't understand each other, I hope, for the benefit of my students, but that is a complication that I think means that there has to be kind of the cognitive mechanisms have to be more sophisticated for parsing when dialectical variation, for example, is something that corresponds to age boundaries versus kind of spatial boundaries. But having said that, I think that's probably less of a feature of smaller scale societies where there's just less specialization and less room for kind of specific role development. Yeah. So another reason that language boundaries might be particularly important ways that people think about social groups is that not only does it organize a lot of human life, but it's something that's rehearsed daily and available to recognize in other people with relatively little interaction, and available in the developmental trajectory even in utero. So there's some evidence that children or infants are able to differentiate their mother's language from a foreign language, at least if they are different on the basis of cadence, for example. And this is just a reminder, this is a map scaled based on ethnologue data on the basis of language diversity. And it's just a reminder also that most of our work on social group boundaries is happening in linguistically impoverished parts of the world, in Europe and North America, Canada, well, not North America, but the US and Canada. So also places where much of the language diversity that we do see is based on recent migrations, as opposed to long-standing kind of diversification processes. Yeah.
So what's the scaling here?
Yeah, I feel like you might have asked me this the last time I presented this, and I haven't looked it up, but it's I think it's from ethnologue data. So what they're not considering like how many speakers of each language there are in order to get the diversity index.
How many different languages?
It's just like how many different languages. And then I think it's probably area proportional to number of languages.
Okay, because Mexico's really big.
Mexico's really big, and probably because there are not that many speakers, but lots of languages. So yeah, places that have kind of successfully, the places where we do our research are places that have successfully kind of eliminated a lot of language diversity. So this is part of the motivation. There are others, I'll tell you in a bit. But it's part of the motivation for my doing research in highland Peru along the Quechua-Aymara language boundary. And I'm going to try to address two main research questions today. One, whether ethnic phenomena are products of a single evolutionary process or distinct evolutionary processes. So can we, that map that I showed you with sub-functions, is there any evidence that they are sub-functions, or is there really kind of just this group psychology mechanism that applies to all these different phenomena? And then, do humans privilege linguistic boundaries when learning about and interacting with others? So there's a developmental component to this. Are children privileging particularly language as a cue to group membership for each of these different functions? And so to keep us all on the same page about where I'm going, I'm actually going to preview the results. And I'm going to show you evidence for each of these possible functions, so in-group altruism, stereotyping, and stability beliefs. And show you some evidence that in-group altruism is particularly organized at the level of communities. There's more stereotyping about kind of categories or variation related to market integration than related to other kinds of social, group diversity. And really, they don't have strong beliefs that any identity is stable that I've tested so far. But on the other hand, there's some evidence that children do seem to privilege language as a basis for in-group altruism. That's a bit weak, hence the tilde, stereotyping, and beliefs that identities are stable. So this will also form the rest of my outline after I describe a bit of this field site. So why did I go to Peru? In addition to just being more linguistically diverse, it's a trilingual area. I wanted to find a strong test case for some of these hypotheses about the importance of language boundaries. And this is not a great picture, but do I animate it anywhere? Oh yeah. So it's in this, I went to the southern Peruvian highlands, close to the border with Bolivia, close to Lake Titicaca, and right to that star, which is on the Quechua-speaking side of the Quechua-Aymara language boundary. Most people here under age 50 also speak Spanish, but a lot of people who are older, actually like in Cyprus, are bilingual Quechua and Aymara, and don't speak Spanish. And there's some trilingualism as well. So just to be clear, Quechua and Aymara are mutually unintelligible languages. They're not particularly related to each other, and most of the similarities that they have are based on their having been in contact with each other for centuries, as opposed to because they share a common ancestor. Which becomes particularly important because it suggests there's not this kind of like immigrant versus newbie, but immigrant versus local divide between these two languages. They've both been in this area for a really long time, and the participants with whom I work don't make a distinction between one of them being more recent than the other. Okay, so here's a landscape. I was based on this town, Matasani, which is color-coded yellow for the Quechua-speaking, so the majority Quechua-speaking side of the river. Here's the majority Aymara-speaking side of the river, so the closest communities to town are actually predominantly Aymara-speaking. And this kind of division is reflected in the high school in town, which services the region more generally and is pretty much evenly split between Quechua and Aymara-speaking students. Most people in this community engage in agropastoralism. This is an alpaca. Somebody, I'm pretty sure, yeah, alpaca. Somebody asked me if I could tell the difference between alpacas and llamas. I'm like, sometimes it's hard, but I'm pretty sure this is an alpaca. So most engage in agropastoralism, mostly with sheep and cows, but there's quite a lot of variation also in market integration, so a lot of people have shops or engage in trade outside of town. So in addition to this feature of neither of them being an immigrant community, so you can kind of control away that confound that is more commonly the case in like the US and European societies where people study these kinds of questions, is that it's not a racialized boundary either. People don't think that they can tell each other apart on the basis of being Quechua or Aymara speaking, based on kind of morphological differences. There's relatively little power imbalance between them. They're both much more disenfranchised than like the urban, more mestizo populations in the country. And this market integration differential, as will become clear, is a much more important marker, or much more important organizer of behavior than the language boundary is. There's relatively little hostility between them as well. So these are pictures of Aymara-speaking women and Quechua-speaking women that I took on the same day while they were celebrating the same ritual, using the same traditions in the same way in the same area. So that brings me back to the slide picture, which is based on this religious festival, and I actually couldn't tell you, and this might be my incompetence, but I don't think so, who is Quechua or Aymara speaking, except on the basis of recognizing a couple individuals. The only way that I think they've told me that they might be able to tell them apart is that Quechua women use slightly less bright colors of clothing. So I don't know, that might be true here, but there are definitely overlapping distributions. And this is another place where, at a different site on the other side of the boundary, so on the Aymara-speaking side of the boundary, where the face of Jesus Christ appeared the last couple of years. And again, it's becoming a ritual shrine that is appealing to both sides of the boundary. So in contrast, some of these market integration differences have real consequences for people's lived experiences. So you can afford to build like a 3-story brick house instead of an adobe house if you're a miner. as opposed to an agropastoralist. You can afford to eat starchier but also fried foods as opposed to like rely on your own subsistence practices. And this is a kind of important difference in organizing lives and a bit of a status marker as well. Okay, so in a place like this, do we see any evidence that linguistic boundaries motivate in-group altruism? I'm going to show you some data to suggest it doesn't much among adults using ethnographic interviews, economic games, and some implicit bias tests, implicit association tests. I only have developmental data for this last one, unfortunately. So I think one of the most striking features is that Watasani is part of this district that was historically part of this Quechua-speaking province of Putina. So they were majority Quechua and in a majority Quechua province. And actually in the 1970s, they willingly switched to become part of Huancane province, which is a majority Aymara speaking province. So they willingly became a linguistic minority in the 70s, suggesting that they didn't think that this was going to be like politically disadvantageous. And they don't regret it. Like I didn't meet anyone who said that was a bad idea. But it's possible that this is cheap talk and that when there are real stakes on the line, they would show some allocation biases. So we did some economic games with both regional and linguistic group boundaries. So we asked people to allocate resources. So this is where I'm based, the star, and we asked them to allocate resources between an in-group member from the same region or a linguistic, so a regional out-group member who's linguistically the same, so also Quechua speaking, or a regional between themselves and a regional out-group that's Aymara speaking. Okay, does that make sense? So we had half of participants had to allocate between an in-group, a person from the in-group village from Watasani, or an out-group village from a Quechua-speaking community. And the other half had to allocate resources between another in-group village person and an out-group village person from an Aymara-speaking community. And they had these 5 soles, which is about a third of a day's wage, to allocate between them. Okay, so this is the proportion of those 5 soles that people gave on average to other members of their own village. So these are Quechua-speaking participants giving to other Quechua-speaking participants in their village. And they did show a slight bias towards giving towards members of their own village, their own community. But as long as the individuals were from out-group villages, it didn't really matter much whether the out-group village was Quechua-speaking or Aymara-speaking. And we actually did a different game, which I won't get into it, but we were concerned that there might be reputational effects, so they didn't want to see like they were biased towards the, for self-representation reasons, but in terms of the experimenter effect, even though it was supposed to be anonymous. So we introduced a random element in another study, and if anything, it actually decreased the difference between out-group Quechua and out-group Aymara. So clearly they have an in-group bias, but it's at the village level rather than on the basis of language differences. Okay, but perhaps language differences, linguistic differences do affect implicit biases that they might have. So I tried to use an implicit association test. I don't know how you guys feel about this. Just to quickly, in case anyone's not familiar, these are meant to tap into associations between, for example, good and bad concepts and in-group and out-group. Even if they're not willing to be explicit about it. And with a not very literate population, we had to use audio cues and visual representations of good or bad. So this is something I borrowed from Anzi Barron, who's a developmental psychologist. So when the negative stimuli, like a spider, is on the same side of it, they have to categorize it on the same side of using the same button as the outgroup audio cues. And the good stimuli like flowers and the in-group are on the same button, then these are consistent with positive in-group stereotypes and should be really relatively fast for people to categorize is the idea. Yeah.
So you used extreme stereo separation, is that how you did it? So on the other side, there was an audio cue, or?
So they heard, sometimes they heard speech in Quechua or speech in Aymara. And they had to categorize the speech that they heard as Quechua or Aymara.
Oh.
And then other trials, they had visual representations of flowers or spiders, and they had to categorize them. So I didn't have to do whatever fancy thing you're talking about. And then when the in-group speech was associated with the negatively spiders, the idea is that that would be a slower categorization. And so these are somewhat messy data, and we're able to do it with children as well, but this is the kind of effect that the association, the effect of being in-group on the stimuli being in-group on the association, or the, not the association, on the speed. How is this effect size calculated? The difference in the speed when they're consistent versus not consistent as a function of some of the H. And I'm going to show you why I use these categories, which is to compare it to some of the effects that have been documented for American children and adults, with white participants looking at white and black images of people. So the effect sizes are somewhat smaller than they are in the US, and I tried to look at the effect sizes for Korean-Japanese implicit association tests as well, and they were comparable to the American as opposed to the Peruvian samples here. And if anything, I mean, these are super noisy, but if anything, it's decreasing with age. So the linguistic in-group preferences, I would argue, are fairly weak, and if anything, decrease with age, although I wouldn't say that we have a strong developmental trajectory here. So this confirms kind of the ethnographic intuitions that I had that in this cultural context, the language boundary is not really the main way that they organize cooperative activity or in-group altruism. If anything, there's high levels of cooperative activity at the community level and in-group altruism at the community level. Okay, so in a case like this, then, would we find any evidence of stereotyping? So are there cultural traits that correlate with the language boundary that would promote stereotyping? Again, the ethnographic evidence would suggest not so much, that this isn't a particularly culturally structured language boundary. In any case, I tried to see how beliefs about the language boundary developed through time. So this is a simple task that I was able to use with adults and children, where I presented 3 characters, 2 of whom spoke Quechua, the other one spoke Aymara, and the other 2 were similar because they had the same kind of occupational or market kind of association, market integration kind of activity. And then told them that the bottom character had some novel trait. In this case, they liked eating bado, and asked people to predict who else would be similar. So it's a forced choice test where I forced them to make an inductive inference on the basis of a single individual, either on the basis of language or on the basis of a kind of subsistence or economic activity. And I did this 3 different ways. One, using fictional labels. So, let's see, the first one was using these actual stimuli, like real world languages and real world kind of subsistence activities or economic activities that they would relate to. In another study, I used these fictional labels with arbitrary names for languages and arbitrary kinds of activities, but where I analogized it to the local context, suggesting that these languages were in communities about 1 hour walking distance from each other, similar to the local context. And in the last one, I just gave them the fictional labels with no contextualizing information. So what we found here is that here I'm displaying the probability of making a language-based prediction as opposed to an economic-based prediction in those 3 studies. So when the labels were real-world labels, when the labels were fictional labels, but contextualized according to the local context, and finally when the labels were completely fictional and not contextualized at all. And what we find is an increase in the willingness to rely on language information for making predictions about people when they were removed from the local context. The more removed it was from the real world scenario, the more willing people were to say yes, people will be similar on the basis of the language that they speak. And if anything, when you're presenting them with the real world labels consistent with the ethnographic information for intuitions, they were more likely to make predictions on the basis of market integration kinds of variables or economic variables as opposed to language. Does that make sense to people? Finally, in a fourth study, we used audio cues. So instead of just telling them the labels, the language labels, we actually presented characters speaking, introducing themselves in Quechua or Aymara, and then also introducing themselves in Spanish so that the children would understand the context regardless of the language that they spoke at home. And in this particular case, but not as strongly in the other ones, we found this developmental trajectory where the children really used that linguistic information to make predictions about these characters, even though the adults did not. So the adults behaved pretty similarly, whether it was a label or audio presented information, but the children really ramped up the extent to which they relied on the linguistic cue when it was presented on. Yeah.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding. So 0.5, is that chance?
Mm-hmm.
So it actually like confuses, like using, is it right to say then that using linguistic information confuses their choice about, like if they're doing worse than chance? Like,
So who's doing worse than chance here? The adults?
yeah, I guess so.
Yeah. I mean, so the fact that they're below 50% isn't worse than chance, right? Chance would just be 50, there's no such thing as worse than chance, because I don't have an objective criteria to compare them to. There's no objective criteria in here in terms of like what's accurate. But 50% would be chance. It'd be like they don't know whether people are more similar if they speak the same language or if they're engaged in the same economic activity. But I'm hesitant to interpret this way because it'd be weird for children to know what they were doing and adults not to know what they were doing.
Okay.
So I think what's going on is that there are conflicting reasons why they could see language or economic similarities being important for predicting behavior, and these two phenomena are kind of reaching a 50% mark for the adults.
Okay, so it's just that they were making a prediction or not?
I mean, the data is consistent with adults just flipping a coin,
Okay.
right?
Thanks.
Yeah. So they were making a prediction based on language or they had to choose language or economic subsistence. So it's not like they couldn't have predicted.
Okay.
Does that clarify things?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
Not quite.
Thanks, but I'm not sure what else to ask.
I feel like I'm missing something.
No, I think it's okay.
Yes, so the adults could definitely just be confused and flipping a coin or not taking it seriously, and maybe the kids were really enthusiastic about this and taking it seriously, but for what it's worth, like, there were some of the adults gave unsolicited explanations for why they answered the way that they did, which did suggest that for example, with clothing, like market integration differences could lead you to be able to afford nicer clothing, and so they could make a prediction based on that, but some of them did bring up the fact that the idea that Aymara women wore lighter colored or brighter colored clothing than Quechua women, so that some of them reasoned that way.
Okay.
So I think that kind of leads us to the adult figure. Yeah. Yeah.
Just to clarify,
So it sounds like in the study, people are deciding whether or not linguistic similarities are going to be more predictive of them being actually similar than market similarities. So they're just kind of arbitrarily picking one or the other.
Okay.
In this case, the adults are picking more on the market favor, and children are picking more on a linguistic basis, right?
Yeah. So if I were to like collapse across all the studies, these two studies, like the audio and the other label-based one, like the adults would clearly show a bias towards using the market information for what it's worth.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you had some the depictions of faces or whatever, and
Yeah.
were those the same or did those change?
There were half of them were male, half of them were female, and they were randomized
Right,
across
okay.
trials.
Right.
In terms of I think they were matched in terms of like we always had the braided girls together, for example,
Sure.
and there were some some not braided girls, but yeah. Okay, so to summarize this, what I think is going on in terms of stereotyping or inductive inferences that people are making, I think that adults are willing to use the language as a cue to make predictions about others in novel contexts, novel scenarios, where they haven't already learned that the language isn't really an important organizer of their life. But it's kind of interesting that they're willing to retain the expectation that in other places, in other contexts, other times, it might still be important. And then learn that it's not locally relevant. And then we're also seeing this developmental trajectory where children seem to be privileging the use of this cue, this information, particularly when audio cues are used, when they're actually listening to the language, which is perhaps a more natural context in which to be presented with this information, even in this context where adults are not particularly using that cue, and despite historical changes that would actually move the prediction in the opposite direction. So I don't think this is a cohort effect in the sense that Quechua-Aymara differences are becoming way less important for the younger generation than they were for the older generation. The more salient differences are between being Spanish-speaking, for example, and a speaker of an indigenous language. Yeah.
You looked at that effect separated by the language of the prompt. So like children might use language as a cue when the target speaks their language,
right.
And then when they speak the other language, they just sort of flip going.
Yeah, Alexia asked me if I had done any work on like outgroup homogeneity or if that figured into my conceptualizations, and I guess I could test it with the data that I have, but I hadn't thought of that. So it's possible that they only make the inductive inferences when it's a language they're unfamiliar with. Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good point.
What's the life of children like? When do they start to get integrated with the workforce? How protected are they when they're young?
Yeah, an alternative possibility to it actually being a learning bias that genetically evolved is that they have just different lives and they don't have the same kinds of exposure that adults do. So for what it's worth, I mean, and that's consistent potentially depending on what we think that exposure to diverse languages does. They actually have preschool. It's kind of amazing that Peru has universal preschool access even in rural communities and the US doesn't. So at age 4, they still have to pay for some things like their books and uniform. But at age 4, they can start going to preschool. It's predominantly a Quechua-speaking preschool. Elementary school, predominantly Quechua-speaking. They get a couple of Aymara-speaking people who want to go to the better school that come in. And then it's really high school where it hits that they have like this 50-50 kind of integrated social life. And so that is something else that I've been meaning to do, which is look at whether there's some sort of non-linearity there when they get into high school and they have this much more integrated environment. Yeah.
What language is high school?
So, and all the education is in Spanish. Another funny story, there's a push for indigenous language education in Peru, but it's implemented really poorly. So the preschool actually got Aymara literature in a Quechua-speaking area, so kind of useless. So yeah, all Spanish education.
So, quick question is, in the novel scenarios, it's made-up jobs in a made-up situation too, right? So that all of that is meaningless except for the potential language that they might be hearing?
In the novel scenario, so there was no novel scenario that was audio.
Oh, okay.
It was only with the labels that I used novel scenarios. The audio was only with real-world languages and real-world jobs.
Right.
Anything else? Okay. So finally, in terms of stability beliefs, so it's still possible that people perceive linguistic identities as not very important, not a basis for prosociality, but still something really inherent to people that they can't change. And again, I adopted a method that I have mixed feelings about, but that developmental psychologists like and has been used cross-culturally, which is a switched at birth vignette method, where we tell them the story of a child that's born to one set of parents, birth parents, who are tragically killed in its infancy, and then it's adopted by another set of parents from a different group in ignorance of its birth origins. And then we ask participants, when this child grows up, will he be Quechua like his birth parents or Aymara like his adoptive parents? And it's switched. across participants. And just as a comparison, we also asked the same question about regional categories. So being limeño like his birth parents, or guatasaleño like his adoptive parents, where limeño is like the capital of Peru, like a big market integrated city versus a small community, rural community. Yeah.
Is the name for that language the same as the name for the communities?
I actually, when I did this, it's actually Quechuista versus Aymarista, but that's actually regionally variable. And it's actually an interesting point that I made where Quechuista is the same ending as like socialist in English, right? It suggests that it's kind of a transitory kind of identity as opposed to something fixed. I have some other studies confirming that they do think of those two terms a bit differently. But they understand it both ways, though. Okay, so again, here we have the probability now of choosing that the identity of the child when he grows up will be like the birth parent. So this is kind of like believing that the identity is more stable and fixed at birth or inherited in a genetic-like process as a function of age. And again, we see kind of a similar pattern for the language where before age 8 or so, children are expecting the language to be somehow like genetically inherited from the birth parents as opposed to acquired from the adoptive parents. And the adults mostly think that's implausible and don't really buy that scenario. Just to be absolutely candid, like I collapse all the adult variation. Or I use a negative exponential function to collapse all the adult variations, so I'm not fitting the curve from like 20 to like 80-year-olds. And when we look at the regional condition between limeño, like a capital city, and a rural town, we get like most importantly, like no bias among the children. They seem to be at chance in terms of thinking what that identity is transmitted either in a genetic-like process or a cultural-like process. And even this kind of upward curve in the adults is just a function of a birthplace effect. I did some other studies where I find that if the child is born in a city or in a town, adults think that they're more likely to have that identity just by virtue of birthplace, not because of a genetic-like process. So here we have some evidence that beliefs that linguistic identity are inherited and stable, again, only seem to show up in children in Watasani, despite the adults not really reasoning that way. And we see a contrast in the way that children think about language, now using the labels, importantly, but not really for regional identities. So I have a project that I'm still working on, but using the same method, people have used it in lots of different cultural contexts, to see if this is cross-culturally true. And we're getting some interesting results suggesting that maybe other kinds of differences between groups, like whether groups have a status difference between them or are symbolically marked with clothing, for example, might be as important, if not more important, than language differences. And I'm happy to show you guys that afterwards. I have it prepared there, but I also want to make sure that we have time for questions and discussion. So to summarize, so far, we have very mild, weak evidence that children might have slightly more propensity for having implicit biases against out-group speaking individuals based on language than adults do. Honestly, other people's work, like Katie Kinsler's work, suggests that this might be even there in infancy, where they're reticent or reluctant to accept toys, for example, from people who speak a different dialect than their own parent. But I haven't used those kinds of methods, so I can't compare directly. But definitely by adulthood in this context, communities are the locus of cooperation. I think we have somewhat stronger evidence that children are, for a variety of possible reasons, using language for making predictions about others, but even in this context where adults do not and actually give priority to economic kinds of differences based on particularly market integration differences for making predictions about others. And then also some evidence that children are privileging language as a basis for thinking that an identity is particularly inherent or stable feature of an individual, where adults don't really believe that's the case for any kind of group identity. So if this holds to be a stronger pattern, which not just on the basis of my research, but on several developmental psychologists who are looking at this, there's some evidence that either for functionalist reasons or for byproduct reasons having to do with the way that language acquisition works in humans, that language seems to be integrating with the social cognition machinery, that there could be a genetic basis for this, that then cultural evolutionary processes are not particularly constrained by and are able to diversify in a variety of different directions depending on the kinds of what I was calling like ethnic landscape features that are relevant for each function. Well, I guess that's what I was saying here. So I'm open to the possibility that this kind of pattern is consistent with either adaptations for learning about groups specifically, or for learning about language that then integrates with other mechanisms. Okay. So I do think that minimally we should start thinking about what are the selection pressures that we would expect would produce preferences for in-groups in terms of allocations, in terms of coordination games, which might be different as well, how those might be different than the selection pressures that promote stereotyping or inductive inferences, and those that might be selection pressures for thinking about identities in an essential kind of way or fixed. And then in terms of the second question, we do have some evidence for these early developing cognitive mechanisms that privilege language boundaries for various kinds of social group kinds of questions. Again, evolve for either ethno-linguistic group reasoning because of humans' cultural evolutionary history of forming these ethno-linguistic groups, or because we're a language-speaking kind of species. And to bring this back to some of the kind of developments that have happened in the minimal group paradigm literature, there's actually been a lot of really creative attempts at breaking the minimal group effect that suggests that a lot of it actually has to do, or the allocation, the in-group favoring allocation effects are really dependent on, for example, individuals thinking that the recipient is going to know that they're from the same group or not, or being able to have a change affect the behavior of the other individual. And for example, Yamagishi and his colleagues suggest that this is indicative of kind of a generalized reciprocity expectation about how you're going to interact with groups that are based on certain cultural norms that develop in particular societies. And I was just realizing, I just learned this a couple of days ago, that Teifel and his colleagues were thinking along the same lines before they thought that that was a not very informative theoretical perspective and developed social identity theory instead, which I think is even less predictive. So I think there's a lot of interesting phenomena here, specifically like the in-group allocating, in-group altruism effects seem to fall off if you have these kinds of anonymity effects introduced. But some of the kind of in-group boasting effects, like saying that your group is great, are a bit more stable, but they're also cheap talk, but might suggest different functions again. But I think not to shit too much on the minimal group paradigm, because I do think that this has opened up like this huge question space, or promoted this huge question space of, humans do use a variety of symbolic markers for marking identities, for marking group boundaries. That's true if you look at the ethnographic literature. And that means that we all have to be capable of learning that diverse set of markers that we develop, and to use them in a locally adaptive way. So how to, specifying how those cognitive mechanisms work is still a useful project. So I'm happy to stop there, and if anybody wants to know about some of the more cross-cultural work on the stability beliefs, I'm happy to talk about that later one-on-one, but I want to mostly get your feedback and questions before delving into that. So I should just, I guess, thank these people because, I can't thank them. I should thank these people because they were really important in letting me do the work in their communities, helping me collect the data, and funding some of the work as well. So that button doesn't make it, huh? What should I do? That's weird that it's so sensitive. Anyway, but yeah, happy to talk about that other research as well, but I would rather have questions. Yeah.
So in speech processing, it's been found that listeners weight different acoustic cues differently over time depending on their reliability. So as you age and you lose certain parts of your hearing, you might use different cues. I wonder if the same principle might apply here, that in these communities, language isn't a reliable cue to these differences, but your type of work is, but children just don't know about those cues yet, so they haven't sort of applied that. I'm wondering if there's
I
any-
definitely think that's what's going on. Sorry.
So yeah, I'm just gonna say, are there other societies that, where language is a more reliable cue, and do children privilege, or maybe even adults privilege it more in that type of situation?
Yeah, so I definitely think that's completely consistent with what I think is going on. I would still say what's unclear is why the children would have a bias towards language use, why they're not the ones flipping the coin under that scenario. And yes, there are definitely communities where language is much more predictive of more cultural traits. I actually have made the argument in print, although I'm not sure how much I buy that, it might have been a main organizer of a lot of cultural traits because it reduces the flow of information just for coordination reasons. So I can show you, I don't have cross-culturally systematic data on the stereotyping stuff, the stereotyping method, but the stability effect. Oh, that's okay, I'm gonna bring it back. But a lot of people have used the switched at birth vignette cross-culturally so that I can see whether language differences generally do induce people to think that groups are stable through the life course. And this is the result from that analysis so far. And again, there's age effects here. So what we found was that there was an effect with children in terms of their thinking that language groups were more stable, but adults didn't think that way. And if we look cross-culturally, there's actually an effect through the developmental trajectory. So the purple line are group boundaries that are associated with a language difference, and the pink line is the one where they're not associated with a language difference. They might be associated with dialectical variation, but not a full-blown language difference. And we actually see that it's consistent through the life course, at least within these, it's based on about 20 studies, and maybe about 10 different societies, or with multiple boundaries within societies sometimes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a very similar question to Ben. I guess a follow-up is probably more appropriate. With regards to distinguishing whether or not it was language or work that these children were determining the similarities or based on, seems to me that two different labels versus two different sets of sounds are very different comparisons to make.
Yeah.
And so that in the same way that, for instance, you showed alongside I think it was the children's responses, it was the implicit association test with white people associating based on skin colorizing, because that's also another feature that kind of just pops out and is an inherent difference, kind of, not by virtue of the label, but by virtue of what is it?
The modality basically changes.
Yeah, or rather, well, there's the modality issue, but also there's the, what is it? Salience, I think is a good word for it. So how much different or how aware we are of these things being actually different seems more easily accessible in these language and image comparison tasks than in just a word comparison to another word comparison.
Yeah. So I guess I have a little bit of a beef with the word salience because it seems like a way to not ask the ultimate question of like, well, why is it more salient? But it could be for a really uninteresting reason, right? It could be that, I mean, my intuition would be that it could be that because kids are in this language learning phase of life that they really have to pay attention to how to pronounce things properly, what words to adopt, and like hearing completely different words, some of which they don't even understand, is a really important difference for them than hearing like just one word that's a label. Now, they're also really label learning a lot, for what it's worth. So that's part of the language acquisition process. But maybe just one label as opposed to like a string is a difference. I'm not sure if I can quickly pull it up. I did actually see the same developmental trajectory with the labels as I did with the audio cue. It just wasn't nearly as strong. So
But still trend in the same direction.
definitely. I was trying to see if I can find it quickly. Oh yeah, here it is. Oh yeah, so this is the real world labels, scenarios with labels as opposed to audio cues with, you know, I plotted it two different ways. This is what happens when I try to appease different communities. So I was fine with just doing the fitted curve, but the reviewers wanted dots, so there we go, categorical variables as well. And here we do see that it's also a bit ambiguous because the kids are at chance, right at chance. And so it's harder to know whether they're just confused, like your colleague Matt was saying. But here we also see evidence that the adults, if anything, are like less confused and more convinced that the economic information is the relevant one. And it's pretty much, it's close to consistent across the fictional analogous and the completely fictional case, except, well, there's that movement upwards in the middle category here. And here it flattens out because it's mostly the adults who are really raising their expectations in the fictional situation that they can start making predictions about on the basis of language. But yeah, I think why it's good to talk to cognitive scientists, like I'm not sure how to control for like the amount of information that these different modalities present, and yeah, what would be a good comparison to do instead.
It's hard for me to think about these results as just about language as opposed to language in comparison to something else.
Right. It
Right?
could just be
So if you did the exact same experiments where instead of jobs, it was whether they were dressed like a clown or not,
Right.
I bet you'd get a reversal of effects, or I bet there would be some properties like that would completely reverse the effects, which
Yeah.
gives rise to a concern that, is this about a bias towards language at all?
Or a bias about the economic categories.
Yeah.
I guess the reason why I chose the economic categories, and this is perhaps me thinking too much like an evolutionary psychologist, is that it's implausible to me that, so ethnographically expecting it to be important for the adults, a socially meaningful kind of way to categorize the world, but not something that we might have expected to be an important part of human evolutionary history, because the degree to which we're specialized in these different subsistence domains is relatively recent innovation. At least over larger evolutionary timescales, probably have like really get starting it around the Neolithic, and the kind of division of labor, agriculture, etc. So that was part of the motivation for it. I do have another study where I can control a little bit more for the modality, and that there's all visually presented information. I can't use language there, but looking at sartorial markers, so clothing, comparing it to body morphology differences, so fat versus skinny, comparing it to location cues in the background and facial expressions, like happy, sad. And it's also developmental, so asking them to make predictions on where they could use 4 different cues at the same time. And there we find that everybody, the adults and the children, do use the sartorial markers, so the clothing differences the most, which I guess might not be surprising if that was also an important part of human evolution, or if it's a very common way that societies culturally evolve to signal information to each other about the types of cultural differences that exist. But if that effect was even stronger among the children than among the adults, interestingly. And I think the body morphology is like the best comparison in terms of like the amount of information displayed, and did not feature that prominently in the Peruvian sample. But actually we had an American sample where it figured more prominently for the children there. So, yeah, those results were messy in the US, I have to say, because we were comparing like American undergraduates and like preschool kids in the lab school, and they're not the same community. So like, sometimes shouldn't take my cues from developmental psychologists sometimes, but.
I mean, the way that I think about these cues is a lot like what was talked about with phonological features, in that there just might be accidental correlations that could be learned or fixed in the genome if they're long enough. But there's also perhaps some features of the cues that are different. For example, it would make sense to have cues that are hard to replicate, right? So if I want to mark my in-group, I want to do it with a marker, a symbolic marker that others can't fake, right? And learning a language is hard to fake. Perhaps in poor cultures, getting the right clothing might actually be hard to fake. So it might be an interesting variable to vary as to how easy or hard it is to have an outgroup member generate that cue.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the fakeability question, but I definitely think it depends on the functional, like what the cue is meant for. So if you're just playing a coordination game with somebody where you just want to find somebody else like you, then the fakeability really doesn't matter, because it's in everybody's interest to do the same thing. And I think I was talking to some people, I'm collaborating with an archaeologist that has one of the most unfakeable and intergenerationally transmitted ethnic markers that we know of, which is cranial modification, where in several societies, convergently, they've evolved this technology of cradle boarding infants' heads, either this way, or wrapping them around. And we want to kind of understand what could that have been useful for, given that the individual's not even deciding strategically like to do this themselves, and that it's permanent for life, and that it's not particularly costly if you know how to do it well, but it is costly if you do it wrong, and it could lead to your infant's death. So thinking about, I totally agree with you, and thinking about it kind of in a game theoretic framework of like, what are the functional features of this cue that it can change the game that the kinds of games that you can play with each other is super interesting. And I have a little bit of a negative reaction when people say like, well, language is obviously important because it's not fakeable, because it depends what it's for. Like if I come here speaking like an American, I think I speak like an American, like a Californian, and then start defecting, we still are going to have institutions in place to keep me in, so rein me in and punish me. So it's not enough to say that it's not fakeable, to make sure that it motivates cooperation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask about the point that you made at the beginning, which is that it's important to study these more linguistically diverse areas because potentially represents a source of variation that we would miss if we're only looking at Americans or white Europeans. Particularly given that language didn't seem to be very important for the three examples that you looked at.
Yeah.
I'm curious why this particular community in this area is a better source of general theory than undergraduates at an average American university if they're not showing effects that are different from other cultures.
Well, I guess I would think of it as representing one extreme other side of the distribution of cultural variation, where you can study it here, and if you study Spanish and like how people perceive Spanish and English differences here in the society, you'll have perhaps, I always pick the other extreme of Serbian and Croatian. There's not that much difference between those languages, but they hate each other, and there's been genocide in Serbia, Croatia recently in our history, right? And there's recurring tension, despite it not being a particularly different language. But if you were to study it here, Spanish and English differences, you'd have to deal with the fact that people perceive Spanish speakers to be more recent immigrants, that they perceive them to be lower status, that they perceive them to be racially different. And so this, I think of not just trying to sample randomly parts of the world, but trying to pick your case studies so that they represent something functionally different about the phenomena that you're trying to study, and ideally something like at the other extreme value, and then maybe you can titrate towards something that you could figure out where the threshold effects are. So here you don't see that language figures very prominently. Maybe you can find another site, another case study where there isn't an immigrant divide, there isn't a racialized divide, but there is a status difference, for example, and see what happens there. That would be my approach, but people vary in terms of how they want to use. Some people just say, you should study somewhere else because more diverse understanding of human experience is better. I would say we could try to tailor it a bit more.
I was wondering if you did find this non-linear effect at this age, this period of source, could you tell the difference between linguistically salient features that people pay attention to versus marketplace type features or context that people, like when that slowly gets adopted, the marketplace sort of attention versus, like, could you show the split, like?
In the developmental trajectory?
Yeah, over what kinds of contexts would be linguistically salient versus marketplace salient? Like types of food or vision of something?
Yeah,
or...
so I did have like multiple questions that I asked about, for example, so the one I showed you was a novel food item. I also asked about like a political alliance, like who they would vote for mayor. Another one was who they would be friends with, so those are both on the kind of social side of things. A novel game that they would play, so they're a bit fictional context, but for what it's worth, one of the ones that showed the strongest signal of language really mattering was the political decision. So people expected speakers of, even adults expected speakers of the same language to vote for the same mayor, more than they expected people of the same economic category to vote for the same mayor. And this is probably reflective of the fact that even though there's a lot of integration in town, in terms of the institutions being used communally, the rural areas are still pretty segregated, and so the social networks are probably going to be pretty structured by language still, even if there's not that much cultural content associated with it. So insofar as social networks are affecting political decisions, they kind of are here because it's like, who can you get stuff from, who can you be buddies with? It does affect that, and I don't know if I really have great power to do this, but like you could do that developmental trajectory for each question. But I think that's one that actually seems to map onto reality pretty well into like a real context where language does matter by virtue of spatial segregation.
So going back to the previous question, and without taking anything away from the virtues of the field site or the affordances of not having these confounding issues of status inequity and other tensions and so on, which might drive effects where something like language is just sort of a token, which is all really cool. But it seems to me that in the ancestral past and as a stable ecological feature, shaping a lot of the psychology, presumably, has been warfare, intergroup conflict over contested resources, circumstances wherein one group is already sitting on a resource pile and incentivized to defend it against another group which might be seen as encroaching and so on. So I bet you'd agree, I'd like to know what you think, that those kinds of factors would probably modulate the relevance of these cues or even just of any ethnic marker, and possibly cause very distinct set of patterns to emerge. So what do you think about that, and do you have intentions to look at those kinds of effects, or is that not something you're currently interested in?
Yeah, so I guess there are multiple ways of taking that. For sure, the local, like the context of warfare, et cetera, is going to modulate these effects, at least some of them. I'm not sure if it would affect stereotyping, for example. I'm not sure I would make that a priori prediction. I feel like embedded in that question was that perhaps for much of human evolutionary history, language boundaries were boundaries of intergroup conflict. Maybe.
I'm not so sure about personally, but
Yeah, so I think it's a possibility, and I should be completely frank with that. This isn't the population I'm working with. Isn't some like hunter-gatherer population like plucked from the past. There have been lots of imperial expansions here, and I'm kind of taking advantage of like a natural experiment in a way. So the reason that Quechua is even spoken in this area is because of the Inca expansion, and to some extent so there was an imperial expansion. There's been language diversity loss here. There's been proselytizing in Quechua and in Aymara by religious communities, so that probably has shaped the nature of that boundary there, where possibly over much of human evolutionary history it was more structuring of conflict, warfare, but maybe other not necessarily conflict-ridden kind of intergroup phenomena like trade as well and specialization. So what was the second part of the question?
I was curious what your
Plans.
whether you think that kind of effect is something you want to explore or interact with other researchers to really look at to see if you were to run similar paradigms, but in areas where those things weren't, equal, but in fact were likely relevant to the way people perceive the meaning of that a given target character speaks a certain language, or as a shibboleth of some kind that is a tell.
Yeah. The good thing is that we do have pretty large data sets on like language diversity and where language boundaries form. We don't have as much like good cross-cultural data sets on like actual intergroup attitudes or experience. So I'm happy I would think that the next step forward would be probably picking another like well-chosen case studies for comparison. What I am interested, and I can do right now in terms of like doing systematic cross-cultural comparison, is represented basically in this graph, which is that meta-analysis that I'm trying to do based on the switched up birth literature that already exists, and people happen to have used it cross-culturally. So there is evidence. So these are just like the proportion of people of different ages based on like the data that's already out there published, choosing that the identity of the individual is stable through the life course. And these are the ages of the participants. The circles represent the size of the sample, and you can see what the kind of boundaries are listed along here. So these kind of data help us start getting at kind of maybe central tendencies, or at least which kind of factors influence essentialist beliefs about groups or stability beliefs about groups. And I think I might have mentioned that there is some evidence that when those groups are differentiated in terms of like status differences, there's more this expectation that they're stable through the life course. Most of these are not particularly engaged in war, but there are different degrees of tension. For example, there's quite a lot done between Jewish and Arab populations in the Middle East, and caste differences in India as well. So I think there is more scope for this, but unfortunately, I think more of us want to do like cross-cultural systematic comparisons than people who want to collect that data in the same way cross-culturally. So.
I was wondering whether there are linguistic cues about ethnic identity when individuals from the two communities speak a shared language, so Spanish for the language. And I wasn't sure about which language to communicate in, but at any rate, I was wondering if there are dialectal differences, whether at the phonetic or other levels that people can apprehend
Differentiate. Yeah.
and whether they can use those cues in particular language to.
Well, sorry, I'm saying yes and no. Yes, it's a good question. Most of the people, like if they were in a market context, would just speak Spanish to each other if they're young enough. A lot of older generation of like vendors, particularly who went to different communities, did speak at least some market levels of the other language, so they could just respond naturally. In terms of dialectical cues in Spanish, I've actually spoken to like the best sociolinguists of the area, and they say no, like the Spanish of Quechua speakers and Aymara speakers is equally influenced by the indigenous language structure, but they can't differentiate on the basis of what the indigenous language that they speak is. So I asked I did basically try to do this interview, which was like if you were to approach somebody in the market and you didn't know what language they spoke, like how would you try to figure it out? And they're like, just speak to them. And I'm like, yeah, but if you can't speak to them, what would you do? And like they were like really at a loss. And I think it was during those interviews that some people mentioned the difference in the women's color preferences. There are also differences in style of dress based on region. So if you happen to get somebody from the broader regional differences, a broader regional scale that you can identify like, oh, that's the strict people, then you might be able to infer the language that they speak on the basis of the region that they're from.
Oh, I've asked so many questions
Oh,
already.
all right
Feel
then.
free to-
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question, then sure. So I want to go back to points made earlier about sort of information contents, and I guess I was curious what, a little bit also building on Dave's earlier question, what the lives of kids look like, because that can kind of inform. So let me just put out some ideas, and you can tell me how right or wrong I am.
Yeah.
If kids are mostly interacting with their immediate and extended families, and basically within their communities, so they're interacting mostly. Aymara speaking kids are mostly interacting with family members and community members who speak Aymara. Then the fact that someone doesn't speak Aymara or is a Quechua speaker is a cue that, oh, I'm probably not going to be interacting with them on a regular basis, whereas I would otherwise, right? There's automatically a distinction of like, is this person likely to be at dinner, next week? And then.
So there's positive information in one direction,
Right.
and not so much.
And then,
the other.
and they don't, and then when they get older, the communities start integrating, right? By the time you get to high school, you're mixed up all together. So you've already got, you're likely to interact with someone like this, the fact that their language doesn't actually give you any information about whether or not you're likely to have a class with them or interact with them on a regular basis. Whereas, as you become more economically specialized, that might give you some information. But then I was also thinking, like, in this particular community, for adults, right, language doesn't actually predict necessarily interaction past a certain level, at least given a stranger.
Given a stranger, yeah.
Yeah. And that's sort of what you're doing. You're not saying like your uncle. You're saying given someone you don't know.
Right.
So that there's that as well. But then also, like, if you were to say, well, okay, in this town they're different, whatever, but they're all interacting, so language doesn't tell you that they don't enjoy it. Imagine now, you say, okay, in another land, there's two random people, one speaks French and one speaks Spanish. That tells me, like, these people might be from completely different cultures and have completely different sets of norms and expectations. So it makes sense that language would be a good predictor of all sorts of norms and things about them, whereas role within a culture might be less predictive. So I wonder if there's a way to come up with a way to classify the information content of that kind of signal.
So there's like that intermediate version where like I specified that they're like 3 hours walking distance apart from each other, and like, but even so, it's not perfectly aligned because like in the Quechua-Aymara situation, like the real world situation, they could have theoretically been from the same town, and so there's more. Yes, that's true. There's more of a possibility that they could have been in the same social network, and then when I contextualize it in a way that's analogous, I'm still specifying that no, for sure they're not in the same town. And then when it's no context at all, then it could be that they're different countries. It could be like Brazil versus Peru. So that's the biggest possibility in terms of analogizing from other. So naive individual, where in this society, where would they even learn that language is associated with other cultural content. They have their local context. They have Spanish versus Aymara from like the Peruvian landscape, and then possibly at the nation-state level, they have knowledge of Bolivia and Brazil, probably at best.
And also you, right? They have
And
English
we speak
speakers
English.
who
Yes.
all sorts of weird norms.
Yes, that is definitely true. So those are the best case scenarios for like analogizing what the novel scenario would have looked like, and it would have, like, all of those would have pushed in the direction, well, Brazil, Peru, Spanish, indigenous languages, and me, them, would all push in the direction of there being a bigger difference, for sure. So, yeah, I don't know. It's difficult to think how you would quantify like all of the expectations that they would have about language in their world, and track that through time. I guess that's the ideal, the dream. But I don't know. Do you have ideas? Or like maybe it's just a question of finding contrasting case studies again that would be cleaner than this. I don't know if that would be possible.
We should probably build a model.
I'm fine with that. Like, I agree that the model would do this thing that we're talking about. We could build a model that does exactly what we're talking about in terms of a Bayesian updater, but I'm not sure how we would get the data that would to fit the
Yeah,
models.
you think you probably need a lot of data that's, as you said, difficult to get.
Yeah, that's true.
All right. Well, I think I just ate up the rest of our time
Oh, sorry.
officially.
Okay.
So, it's 5 o'clock, so let's end and thank our speaker, and feel free to